You know that feeling when you're sitting at Thanksgiving dinner, and your uncle, the one with the paid-off house, the 2003 Toyota with 108 horals on 80,000 miles on it, and the grocery store coupons in his wallet, just dropped $600 on concert tickets without blinking. You sat there wondering, how does that math even work? Here's the thing. It works because that uncle isn't bad with money. He's playing a completely different game than everyone else at the table. And today we're going to break down exactly why. We obsess over boomers and their real estate empires. We analyze millennials and their avocado toast, Gen Z and their side hustles, get entire magazine features. But there's this whole generation sitting quietly in the middle, managing money in the strangest, most deliberate, most misunderstood way possible. And nobody talks about them. Generation X. Born between 1965 and 1980. They're your coworker who's quietly stacked more in their 401k than most millennials will see in a decade. Yet they act like they're one missed paycheck from sleeping in their car. Your neighbor who has $60,000 in savings but won't replace the dishwasher until the door falls off. The friend who drops $700 on a Pearl Jam reunion tour but uses a store loyalty card to save 30 cents on pasta. And here's what nobody tells you. Their money psychology is completely unlike any other generation. And it all traces back to a specific sequence of economic gut punches that rewired how they think about every single dollar. My name is Cash, and I spend way too much time thinking about money psychology, financial traps, and why smart people make weird money decisions. If you're someone who wants to actually understand the behavior behind the numbers, not just be told what to do, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this is already making you think. Picture this. It's 1983. You're 10 years old, and your dad takes you to the bank. Same company, 15 years. Same steady paycheck. Every 2 weeks, the teller knows him by name. There's a pension, there's a savings account that actually pays interest. The mortgage has 12 years left, right on schedule. Everything makes sense. Work hard, save money, retire comfortably. The formula works. You've seen it work with your own eyes. You believe it completely. But before we even get to the crash you're thinking of, there's a whole sequence of hits that came first. And most people don't talk about those. The 1981 recession hit working-class families so hard that some households heated their homes with wood and kerosene because fuel oil was too expensive. Interest rates on mortgages climbed above 12%. Kids in Gen X neighborhoods watched their parents work second jobs just to cover the basics. And some of those kids, the ones with no adults home after school because both parents were working, learned something that would define them forever. Nobody is coming to save you. Figure it out yourself. These were the latchkey kids. House key on a string around their neck. Home alone by 3:30, making their own snacks, doing their own homework, solving their own problems. Not because their parents didn't care, because survival required it. And that self-reliance didn't stay in the kitchen after school. It followed them into every financial decision they would ever make. Then it's 1987, Black Monday. The stock market drops 22% in a single day, the largest single-day crash in history at that point. Gen X is in high school and early college. They're watching the adults around them absorb a gut punch they didn't see coming. And the lesson registers, even if it doesn't fully compute yet. Markets can just decide to fall apart on a Tuesday. No warning, no mercy. Then it's the early 1990s. Gen X enters the workforce, and they walk straight into a recession. Companies that promised lifetime employment are handing out cardboard boxes. The Jack Welch era of corporate downsizing is in full effect. Entire layers of middle management just evaporate. Manufacturing jobs are being shipped overseas by the tens of thousands. You graduate with your degree, you do what you were told, and the job market looks at you and shrugs. Some Gen Xers spent their first years in the workforce doing whatever they could find, not because they lacked ambition, but because the doors were closing right as they arrived. That betrayal was quiet, slow, and deeply personal. Then it's 2001. The dot-com bubble explodes. Portfolios that were supposed to fund early retirements get cut in half over months. Colleagues who had been in the workforce for several years finally starting to lock in real retirement savings. Watch the S&P turn negative for 3 straight years. Then September 11th reshapes everything. The economy contracts further. Layoffs accelerate. Gen X is now in their 30s trying to build something, and the ground keeps moving. And then finally, it's 2008. You're 30-something, maybe 40. You did everything right. You bought the house. You funded the 401k. You showed up for 20 years. And you watched your home value crater. Your retirement account get sliced in half. And people you worked alongside for 2 decades get escorted out with security badges deactivated before they reach the parking lot. The formula wasn't just cracked. It was a lie. And that betrayal, stacked on top of every hit that came before it, permanently rewired how this generation relates to every dollar they will ever touch. Here's the first weird thing about Gen X. They are simultaneously the most anxious about retirement and the most consistent savers in the country. According to the Transamerica Center for Retirement Studies, roughly 70% of Gen X say they are genuinely terrified about not having enough in retirement. But they also hold some of the highest 401k contribution rates of any generation. They don't believe it's going to work, but they do it anyway. And the crazy part is that's not a contradiction, that's a strategy. Psychologists call this defensive pessimism. You assume everything will go wrong, you prepare like it already has, and then when it does go wrong, you're covered. It's exhausting as a personality trait, but as a financial framework, it has kept this generation alive through multiple economic earthquakes. And honestly, they're not wrong to be prepared. They watched pensions disappear. They graduated into a recession. They bought houses before the crash. They're not pessimists. They're people who've been burned enough times to stop trusting the oven. But here's something even more interesting about how Gen X responded to the 2008 crash specifically. While a lot of investors panicked and pulled out, locking in their losses forever, a significant portion of Gen X did the opposite. They doubled down. They kept contributing. Some of them increased their contributions while the market was bleeding, because they had been here before. They had seen markets fall and recover. They knew the math of buying low, even when it felt insane. And that discipline, that refusal to flinch, is a big part of why many Gen Xers who got hit hard in 2008 came out the other side in genuinely strong positions a decade later. Not because they got lucky, because they stayed in the game when every instinct screamed to run. Think about what it does to your psychology when the first major economic event you're aware of as a child is watching your parents absorb a blow the system told them would never happen. When you're 12 years old and the adults around you are quietly scared, that image doesn't leave. It becomes the background music of every financial decision you make for the rest of your life. Sound familiar? If you grew up in a Gen X household, or you are Gen X, you have felt this. That low hum of financial anxiety that never fully goes away, no matter how much you have saved. Even with $450,000 in a Fidelity account and a paid-off house, you still drive the same truck you bought in 1998. Not because you can't afford better, because the hum never stops. Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's talk about something Gen X invented, long before it had a name: the side hustle. Federal Reserve data shows Gen X has higher rates of self-employment and secondary income streams than both boomers and millennials. But here's the kicker: most of them still keep the day job. They're not trying to quit the 9-to-5 and live their passion. They're building escape tunnels while keeping the main exit open. That's not ambition. That's survival instinct, with a business license. It's 1994. You're watching your mom's company downsize. People who have been there since before you were born are suddenly unemployed at 52. No warning, no safety net, just a meeting with HR and a number for the severance hotline. That image burned into the Gen X hard drive. Never ever depend on a single source of income. Not because they're entrepreneurial visionaries, because they're terrified, and that's why they have the Etsy shop, the consulting side gig, and the rental property. It's not a hustle portfolio, it's insurance. And there's a fine tree. Actually, let me put it this way. The difference between a Gen X side hustle and a millennial side hustle is the motivation. Millennials often want freedom from the 9-to-5. Gen X wants a backup exit in case the 9-to-5 disappears without warning on a random Wednesday. One is chasing a dream, the other is building a fireproof safe around their income. Both end up at the same place, multiple revenue streams, but the psychological fuel behind them is completely different. One is optimism, the other is memory. Here's something that absolutely confuses marketers. Gen X will job hop without a second thought, fire off a resignation email on a Tuesday, and never look back. But they're weirdly, almost irrationally loyal to brands. Research shows Gen Xers are significantly more likely than millennials to stick with brands from their youth, even when cheaper options exist. They'll walk out of a Fortune 500 company without hesitation, but they'll drive 20 minutes out of their way for the coffee shop where the owner remembers their order. Zero loyalty to institutions, intense loyalty to people and products that have earned their trust. The psychology is straightforward. When you understand the history, institutions betrayed them. Specific, documented, personal betrayals. When a corporation does it, you get a form letter and a severance check. When a person betrays you, at least you can hold them accountable. So yeah, they're still wearing Levi's, still driving the Toyota, still listening to the same bands from 1993. Not because they're frozen in the past, because those things have never lied to them. And in a life full of systems that change the rules without notice, that consistency is worth something real. Now here's where Gen X gets really interesting. They have obsessive savings habits and genuine emergency funds. But they also pioneered the idea of spending heavily on experiences over stuff. Research consistently shows Gen Xers spend more in actual dollars on concerts, travel, and live events than any other generation. We're talking roughly $3,000 a year on experiences, and that number climbs when you factor in the Gen Xers who treat a concert weekend the way other people treat a car payment. They are financially paranoid and experientially extravagant at the exact same time. And the crazy part is, the same psychological wound drives both behaviors. They save obsessively because systems can't be trusted. They spend on experiences because stuff can't be trusted either. Your house can go underwater. Your 401k can get cut in half. Your car loses value the second you leave the lot. Your possessions mean absolutely nothing when the market tanks. Think about it this way. Imagine you bought a house in 2006. Beautiful home, good neighborhood, everything you were told to do. By 2010, you owed more than it was worth. The thing you were told was your greatest investment became your greatest liability overnight. But that road trip you took in 2005, that camping weekend with your kids, that concert where everyone knew every word, nobody can foreclose on those. The bank cannot repo a memory. And Gen X figured that out, not from a financial advisor, not from a book, but from watching the physical things in their lives lose value in real time, while the memories stayed exactly where they were. Alright, real talk. Have you ever caught yourself saying, "I have money saved, but I still feel broke"? Drop a yes or no in the comments, because that might be the most Gen X sentence ever written, and I want to know how many of us are actually living it. Let's talk about Gen X and financial advisors, because this relationship is genuinely complicated. Data shows they are the least likely generation to use traditional financial advisors. They would rather research everything themselves, build their own spreadsheets, manage their own portfolios. But here's the thing, they're also the most anxious about whether they're doing it right. They don't want help, but they're terrified of getting it wrong. Think about it this way. Gen X came of age in a time when you could actually learn something from a book and figure it out yourself. They're among the last who genuinely believe self-education works. So they read the finance books. They pull the IRS publications. They build the Excel models. They watch the tutorial videos and take notes. Because they believe they can learn how. But they also watched what happened when their parents trusted experts with their pension funds. And those experts either couldn't stop the damage or were actively benefiting from the system that caused it. And then 2008 happened, and some financial advisors were literally bragging about how little they lost compared to other people's losses. That was the moment for a lot of Gen Xers. You watched your account drop 30%, and your advisor's pitch was that it could have been worse? Hard pass. So they educate themselves. They verify everything twice. They trust no one's advice without running their own numbers first. That's not arrogance. That's a completely rational response to lived experience. Now, some Gen Xers do eventually find a fee-only advisor they trust, someone who shares their obsession with worst-case scenarios and doesn't try to sell them products. When that happens, the relationship tends to stick, because Gen X loyalty to people who earn their trust is real and lasting. But it has to be earned, completely, and that process takes time. Here's a stat that surprises a lot of people. Gen X carries the highest total debt load of any generation. But here's the thing, most people don't realize. They are also the most strategic about how they use it. They'll take on a $450,000 mortgage and not lose a night of sleep. But they will not carry a $1,500 credit card balance. The difference is control. A mortgage is predictable. Fixed payment, clear timeline, you know exactly what you're dealing with and when it ends. Credit card debt is a leaking bucket. It never stabilizes. It expands. It charges you interest on the interest. And they watched it swallow families whole in the 1980s and 1990s. Here's how that math actually works, because this is where it gets dark. Someone carries a $5,000 credit card balance at 24% APR. They make the minimum payment every month. Do you know how long it takes to pay that off? Over 20 years. And they will pay roughly $8,000 in interest on top of the original $5,000. That $5,000 couch costs them $13,000 and 2 decades of financial drag. And here's the thing, the people who designed that system know exactly what they're doing. There's an old line that says those who understand interest earn it, and those who don't pay it. Gen X watched their parents pay it. They made a decision. They were not going to be the ones paying. The lesson wasn't never borrow. It was only borrow what you can map to completion. They'll leverage debt for assets they believe will appreciate: real estate, a business investment, a strategic move with a measurable return. But buying a couch on a store credit card, charging a vacation and carrying the balance, that's the debt that kills you slowly. And they know exactly what that looks like because they watched it happen in real time, in their own households, in their own childhoods. They remember the look on their parents' faces when the credit card statement arrived. That look doesn't leave you, it becomes a compass. And now we arrive at the punchline, maybe the most underrated financial behavior of any generation. Gen X keeps paper records. Studies show the majority of Gen Xers maintain physical files of important documents compared to a fraction of millennials. They're not technologically behind. They literally built the internet. But they also remember when companies lost databases, when digital promises evaporated, when a flood or a hard drive crash took everything and there was no recovery. They grew up saving their work on floppy disks and learning the hard way to always save early and save often, because computers crashed without warning and took everything with them. That habit never went away. It just migrated from floppy disks to fireproof safes. Digital banking app? Absolutely. Paper statement? Also yes. Cloud backup? Sure. External hard drive in a separate location? Obviously. Fireproof safe with physical copies of every document that matters? Non-negotiable. It seems excessive, until you've actually lived through multiple system failures and watched people lose things they can never get back. Tax returns going back 30 years. Insurance documents. The deed to the house. Social security statements. They fully expect the government to dispute someday because they have zero confidence the system will be solvent by the time they need it. That's not paranoia. That's called redundancy by design. And it's the same logic that makes them keep an emergency fund for the emergency fund, a backup for the backup, and a plan C they've already written down in a notebook somewhere. Here's the thing, most people never say out loud about Gen X. They are not just financially prepared. They are psychologically prepared, in a way that no other generation quite matches. They've been told, don't worry, enough times to stop believing it. They've heard, it's a sure thing, enough times to know nothing is a sure thing. They've watched institutions, employers, banks, the government, the housing market, the stock market, change the rules without warning, without apology, and without consequence. And their response wasn't to give up. It wasn't to rage against the system. It was something far more practical and far more powerful. They adapted. They learned. They built backup plans to the backup plans, and then kept going anyway. So here is what Gen X money psychology really tells us. When you step back and see the whole picture, they are not confused. They are not contradictory. They are adapted, specifically, precisely, permanently adapted to an economy that promised them stability and delivered chaos. Multiple times, from multiple directions, over multiple decades. They are financial survivalists with retirement accounts, expense spreadsheets, a fireproof safe in the closet, a side hustle running quietly in the background, and concert tickets already paid for because that memory is going to outlast whatever the market does next Tuesday. They trust nothing completely. They prepare for everything relentlessly. They play the game better than almost anyone. And they never forget for a single second that the game is rigged, because they have the paper documentation to prove it. Remember that kid in the bank in 1983, watching their dad make a deposit at a company that would be around forever. They learned the lesson they were supposed to learn. Work hard, save consistently, trust the system. They just also learned the hard way, more than once, across more than 3 decades, that the system can change the rules whenever it wants. So now they play the game. They play it well. They play it better than almost anyone. They just keep a paper copy of every document, proving they played by the rules. And somewhere in a fireproof safe, right next to their 401k statements and their old tax returns, there's a ticket stub from a concert in 1994. And nobody, no market crash, no corporate downsizing, no failed formula, can ever take that away from them. If this changed how you think about the money, psychology behind a generation that almost nobody talks about, pass it along to someone who needs to hear it.